Don't underestimate the power of a narrative, says this week's guest. Pretty timely advice after last month or so of executives putting out pretty stark statements, the stock market taking a beating, and economics figures surprising everyone, all affecting our perception of what's really going on. We spoke to Jim Rickards this week. Jim's a best-selling author on matters of finance and precious metals with a fascinating background as a lawyer. He joined me this week to discuss perception, the Ukraine war, and why the White House is so frustrated. Now, perception is something that we are going deep in with at the moment. Previous guests such as Ned Naylor Leyland and Don Durrett discussed it with us, and it's a theme we think deserves a lot of attention. Every day we are bombarded with economic headlines, political announcements, newspaper headlines, market charts, and CEO tweets, and they're all telling us what is apparently going on. But it can be very difficult to relate this back to what's happening on the street, in the grocery store, or the gas station, or even in the gold price. This is where I started my conversation with Jim. As you can imagine, the answers are insightful and littered with both current and historical evidence for why we are where we are today. Now, if you enjoyed this interview, be sure to share it, to tweet it, and to hit the like button. And if you haven't already, why not subscribe to GoldCore TV? And don't forget, we have a brilliant new show just launched, the M3 Report. It features bonus material from today's guest, Jim Rickards, and some fresh insights from our own team as well. And also we have technical analysis from Garrett Soloway. For now, enjoy the full interview. Jim Rickards, welcome to GoldCore TV.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. Now, I just want to refer to a tweet, or part of a tweet that you circulated recently, which says, in the battle between propaganda and reality, propaganda wins in the short run, but reality always wins in the long run. Now, you've talked about behavioral manipulation in the past, and we're discussing perception and the manipulation of perception. And recently, we've had the White House press secretary trying to convince us that the US economy is in a strong place. We have Biden, who is trying to convince us that inflation is down to Putin's price hike. And we've also have JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon telling us to prepare for an economic hurricane. So there's definite attempt to establish a narrative here and control perception. What does Jim Rickards see when he looks at the current state of financial markets?
Well, I think that's a pretty good summary. The tweet just meant, what is propaganda? Propaganda usually comes from the government, although there are a lot of enablers, whether it's big tech or Wall Street or the media. So there are a lot of amplifiers, but usually can be sourced to the government. It's designed to create a perception, persuade people of certain things. Unfortunately, people tend to trust their governments. I think that's probably a bad idea. I think history says it's usually a bad idea, not always, but usually. So in the first instance, people hear the government say, the economy's fine, or unemployment's near an all-time low, which is actually statistically is true, and they kind of nod and go, yeah, it's all good. And then reality is the stuff that hits you in the head like a 2x4, which is, you go to the gas station and with US dollar prices anyway, ones I'm familiar with, it used to be $45 to fill up your tank. Now it's $85 or $90. I don't drive a pickup truck, but I hear from the F-150, the Ford F-150 is the most popular pickup truck in America. I think they sell more of them than they do cars, but those I think are now up to like $150 to fill it up, probably a 20-gallon tank. So that's the reality. So all of a sudden you're like, well, wait a second, White House is saying it's all good, but the price of gas has doubled. And then there are all kinds of ripple effects from that, which is you have to fill up your car. You've got to put food on the table. You got to pay for the roof over your head. If all those things are costing more, which they are, that's very clear. That's less money for everything else. Maybe you're not taking your spouse out to dinner on Friday. Maybe you're not buying new clothes or taking a vacation. You're going to cut out all those other things. So yeah, you're spending money, but on the necessities, but it means there's demand destruction on anything that's not necessary, and that's a big part of the economy because of service sector and all the people who cater to that. So the propaganda is positive. We can talk about that in a little more detail. The reality is harsh, and reality wins because you're paying real money, as I described. I don't put a lot of stock in anything Jamie Dimon says. He's He says the hurricane's coming. All right, what does that mean? Yeah, I don't really buy the metaphor. Give me data, give me analysis. I'll listen to that. I, have my own data, well, not unique to me, but data that I focus on, perhaps more so than others, my own models. So, and I put that out there, and I'm happy to debate it, or, if people have a critique, I'm always listening, but it's sort of, kind of has to be fact-based. Now, you mentioned the word narrative, and that's really important. And there's a very good book on this by Robert Schiller, Nobel Prize winning economist at Yale University. I'm not a huge fan of your garden variety PhD economists, but there are some good ones out there, and he's one of them. He wrote a book about, 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less, called Narrative Economics.
Mm.
And he said, yeah, we got all the models, and Phillips curve, and wealth effect, and various quantity theory of money, and some have a place, some are more valuable than others, but don't underestimate the power of a narrative. A narrative is a story. It's basically it's a fancy name for a story, but a story that persists, that grows. And interestingly, and I'd done this some years ago, it was interesting to see he glommed onto the same model, which I think is really perceptive. In epidemiology, of course, we've just come through a pandemic, right? So, and that we're all, kind of amateur epidemiologists, but I had studied it for other reasons. There's a model called the SEIR model that stands for susceptible. Are you susceptible to a virus? E for exposed. Are you exposed to it? I, are you infected? Did you get it? And R, did you recover? The difference between I and R are people who died. But it's a model, and it's mathematically based, and it's empirically validated, of how viruses spread exponentially. And you can also use it to forecast how a virus is going to go. I wouldn't listen much to the Imperial College in London, but there are other people who do some pretty good forecasting with that. Well, what Schiller did, he took that model, moved it over to economics, and took a narrative, kind of like a virus, not in a negative sense, but just as something that spreads. And it can be very powerful, and then eventually may die out or reverse, but it can be powerful in the meantime. That much I knew, but what I learned from the book that I hadn't really thought about is that narratives don't have to be true. They can be true, and they can be very powerful, but a narrative can be false and still be powerful. If it's the self-fulfilling prophecy, if enough people believe it, it sort of becomes the reality to some extent, even if it's based on false premises. He gives an example during the Great Depression. The Great Depression really was two technical recessions, but there was a period from 1929 to 1933, election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then there was another period from 1933 to 1937. The 37 and 1940 part we leave aside for this purpose. But during the first part of the Great Depression, unemployment was high, productivity was, output was dropping, trade was dropping. It was a very, very bad time, no doubt about it. But not everybody was out of work. Not everybody was poor. There were a lot of people with a lot of money at the time, but it was felt that being ostentatious was poor form. It's like, okay, I'm lucky I have a job, I've got some money, but I'm not going to buy a new car, buy a big house, or flash it around or whatever, because it's really not considerate of all the people who actually have fallen on hard times. Well, that was the narrative, but it's the worst possible economic advice, because it's precisely the fact that people with the money should keep spending that kind of can boost the economy out of a depression. So by people saying, well, even though I have the money, I'm not going to spend it because it's poor form, we're actually prolonging the Great Depression. Now, when FDR came along, was elected in 1933, became president in 1934, the psychology turned 180 degrees. And all of a sudden, the Democratic campaign song was "Happy Days Are Here Again." And, FDR seemed to solve the banking crisis and so forth. And all of a sudden it became okay to spend money. Well, in the middle of the Great Depression, 1934 to 1936, those were some of the strongest years ever for the stock market. And unemployment did come down a lot. Now, the problem is it came down from like 25% to 15%. Well, 15% is still, painfully high, but it was a big move in the right direction. So he describes how the narrative flipped from don't spend money, it's poor form, to, yeah, go spend money and help the economy. None of that is taught in business school. It's not taught in economics. it can be modeled using this epidemiology model, but it doesn't fit into any of the standard macroeconomic models. But it's powerful stuff. And so today, what's going on is that the White House is trying to push a narrative, and they're failing badly. But they'll say, if you listen to the deliberations among White House officials, you know, some of the stuff leaks to the press, and I know some of these people. It's like the economy is great, unemployment's really low. We've created all these jobs since the pandemic, but we're doing a really bad job of messaging. We can't, you know, Biden is screaming at his staff. The communication staff are quitting in droves. Kamala Harris is a joke. I mean, forget her. But the point is, they're inside the White House. They're frustrated that the positive economic story is not getting out. The correct analysis is that there is no positive economic story. The economy is in terrible shape. The problem is not the messaging; it's the message. And this is why I say the propaganda from the White House that things are great is at odds with the reality, which is things are not great. Let me give you some specific data points, because as I say, I don't like to make statements like this without backing it up. So first quarter, you know, I do, you know, a fair number of interviews, and I'm frequently asked, Jim, are we going to have a recession? And if so, when do you expect it? And my answer is, we may be in a recession right now and not know it. And here's why. The classic, or the accepted definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. There's a few bells and whistles around it, but basically 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP is the definition of a recession. Well, U.S. growth in the first quarter of 2022 was negative. It was negative 1.5%. The best estimate, this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, GDP now, it's not perfect, but it's, you know, my experience is the best estimate out there, is projecting second quarter GDP at 0.9%, not 9%, but 0.9%. Well, you take negative 1.5 and 0.9, add them together, that indicates a loss for the first half. It wouldn't necessarily be 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, because we might, you know, scrape through to some positive growth in the second quarter, but maybe not. I mean, 0.9% is a rounding error from negative. And so we could actually be in a recession and not know. So that's the reality. Happy talk won't work. You know, narratives are powerful, but reality is more powerful.
And then if we talk about Putin's price hike, I mean, obviously when they talk about the US economy being strong, it's obvious with respect to what that motivation is there. But when it comes to Putin's price hike, is that just purely political, saying it's not our fault?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of one. Well, you look at the White House, it's been one fiasco after another. It's a long list. We don't have time to go down the list, starting with the retreat and surrender in Afghanistan, and you know, obviously the inflation, which is now out of control, and you know, Biden's failures to get certain legislation through, and then pushing legislation through that actually caused the inflation or contributed to it. I think Larry Summers did a good job of outlining that. So, and more, but it's just kind of one disaster after another. But where you know, where we are today, the Putin price hike, I'll give the writer credit for good alliteration. You know, Putin price hike. Okay, I'm a writer, so hey, nice job. But it's completely false. Number one, the inflation was going up long before the war in Ukraine started. So if everything was great until February 27th, and then Russia invades, and then all of a sudden the inflation goes up. All right, let's talk about it. But that's not true. This inflation goes back to late 2021. It was persistent in the fall. We all remember the Fed and the Treasury saying transitory, transitory, transitory. And then finally, I think Jay Powell was testifying before Congress in, I want to say January, you know, could have been early February, but he said, it's time to retire the word transitory. So that was his way of throwing in the towel. And Janet Yellen admitted she was mistaken also. So it predates the war, number one. Number two, oh, gee, energy prices are going up because there's a war with Russia. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, the reason is not because Putin invaded Ukraine, it's because the U.S. counterattacked with financial sanctions. Now, bear in mind, go back to January 21st, 2021, when Biden was sworn in as president, and then went back to the White House. What was the first thing he did? He closed the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline that would bring oil from Alberta, Canada, into the United States, where it would connect at a hub believe it's in Kansas, but somewhere in the central United States. And then the hub distributes it to the entire country. So he shut down that pipeline, which curtailed the supply of oil from Canada. Then ended new leasing, oil and gas exploration leasing on federal lands, handicapped the fracking industry, and took a number of other steps using environmental tools, climate alarm, government subsidies, et cetera, to basically, to the extent possible, shut down the U.S. energy industry as much as possible. Now, you can't shut down completely, of course, but everything happens at the margin. And then we end up with oil prices doubling or tripling, really, from $40 to $120 in under a year, which is comparable to what happened in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo. And then Biden wakes up and says, guess we need more oil. And he wants to reopen leasing. I said they shut it down. They did, but he wants to reopen it. He's begging Saudi Arabia to pump more. Saudi Arabia is kind of not returning his phone calls. He's begging Venezuela to pump more. Oh, great. The greatest pariah dictator in the Western Hemisphere, and we're begging him for oil. So why don't we drill our own oil? Because we were a net exporter up until 2021. And then Biden came in, we lost that edge and became a net importer, including recently buying oil from Russia. They curtailed that for political reasons, but that's kind of where we got to. So you wonder why the price of energy is going up. In other words, this damage was self-inflicted. Now, Russia is happy to supply all the oil and natural gas we want. Russia hasn't cut off oil exports. They did reduce natural gas exports slightly to Poland and Finland. Of course, that was a political message. The message to Poland was, hey, stop being a transit point for arms to Ukraine. And the message to Finland was, don't even think about joining NATO. Okay, so those are political points. But the main flow of natural gas to West Germany, Italy, and to a lesser extent, France, Eastern Europe, Romania, and elsewhere has not been interrupted. I mean, the irony is, you hear a lot about it, the G7 message, we're going to end Russian exports of coal. And then the EU met, and we're going to end imports of Russian oil. And we're going to work on getting rid of Russian natural gas, et cetera. These are all announcements. None of them are in effect. This is all talk. The coal ban, so-called, we have our energy czar, climate czar, sort of a fraud, John Kerry, flying around his private jet, trying to get rid of CO2 emissions. But that doesn't take effect until the end of August, if it ever does. The end of the Russian oil by ship, they're still sending it in by pipeline because Hungary insisted. That doesn't take effect until December 31st. And in the meantime, the oil and natural gas is still flowing. Germany's still paying Russia for the oil and natural gas. Putin's taking in $21 billion of hard currency, dollars and euros per month. And those amounts are not frozen. There's limits on what he can do with it, but he's getting the money. And Russia's paying Ukraine transit fees because most of the pipelines run through Ukraine. So here you have West Germany financing Russia's pursuit of the war and Russia financing Ukraine's pursuit of the war, all in the interest of keeping the oil and natural gas flowing, which they are. Now, we'll see what happens later this year, but I think my view is that it was sort of a bet that maybe the war would be over by then and you wouldn't actually have to do any of this stuff. But don't be misled by the headlines because they're, again, this narrative, but they're not actually doing it. So the point being, the price increase at the pump and the inflation in the US has very little to do with Putin and everything to do with the US handicapping its own energy industry, begging dictators for oil, and the influence of the climate alarmists. And by the way, don't underestimate the extent to which the climate alarmists who surround Biden, although I should include Gillian Tett of the Financial Times, but that whole crowd want higher gas prices. They want gas to be $7, $8, $9 a gallon because they expect that will accelerate the transfer to electric vehicles and make the electric vehicle more attractive relative to the internal combustion engine. Now, that's another fantasy. It won't happen. We don't have time to go through all the physics of it. Output of energy by weight, gasoline compared to batteries and the pollution of batteries and the fact that, we don't have the charging stations. And even if we did, where's that electricity coming from? Oh, coal.
It's a false economy.
Well, it's, yes, it is, but it's worse than that. It's actually not in the feasible set. It will never happen. But they're pretending, but meanwhile, they're destroying the US economy in pursuit of an ideological point that will never actually happen. Another example of propaganda versus reality. So most of this has very little to do with Putin, everything to do with hidden agendas from the Green News scam and self-inflicted damage from the White House.
So we've got the White House then saying everything is good. We've got Putin's price hike, inflation. All these narratives are being managed. They are not what they appear to be on the surface, as you've so eloquently put it. They also don't look to be possible of resolving at any time soon. So what's the outlook then over the next couple of years?
Very negative, because let's just take the war in Ukraine. The kinetic war, the fighting, may actually be over sooner than a lot of people expected. You can't be certain of that. I mean, war is, the fog of war. It's hard to tell. But what's happening is that the Ukrainian armed forces are being annihilated by the Russians. I mean, Russia's clearly going to win. You got to define victory, but Russia's obviously going to win. The Ukrainians are being annihilated. Pretty soon there won't be anyone left to fight. Now, you can send all the weapons you want, but if there's no one there to operate them, I mean, there are all kinds of stories where Russia has had good intelligence. Like some of these systems have gone in. From the UK seem to be the biggest warmongers, even more so than the United States. But the US, UK, Germany, Netherlands, Poland, and others have contributed these weapons. Not as many as a lot of people think, but some. But when you get to Ukraine, the transportation network is highly degraded at this point. They've been put in sort of weapons warehouses for distribution, and Russia hits the warehouse with a missile, so they get blown up. I don't know who's paying for this, I guess the US taxpayers, but that's been going on. Then, so it's very, very difficult to get them to the front. There are practical things that people don't understand. For example, the Russian railroads were left over from the Soviet Union. They run on a different gauge than the Polish railroads.
Yes.
So you bring the things into Poland, you want to put them on a Ukrainian train, you got to take them off, put them on donkey carts, bring them over, put them on a Ukrainian train, take them to the warehouse, and the Russians blow it up. So, and then some of the stuff does get to the front lines, not much, but they're out of ammunition. And then there was a good story the other day where the Ukrainian battery, the people handling the howitzers, they had like a very sophisticated laser rangefinder to target, to hit the target, and it's kind of set to calibrate the howitzer. But the instructions were in English and they couldn't read English. So I do read English, but I'm not sure I would know how to work a laser rangefinder on a 155 millimeter howitzer. But even if I did, they didn't read English. So they went to Google Translator and translated into Ukrainian. So they're sitting there with no training, English instructions that are probably hard to follow anyway, even if you had a lot of training, through a Google Translator into Ukrainian, trying to figure the thing out. They're lucky they didn't blow themselves up. So meanwhile, sadly, they're being killed in large numbers. So, but the problem is, getting back to the economy, is that Biden and the Europeans, who I think are beginning to regret they ever listened to the United States, have said they will not remove the sanctions until all the Russian troops are out of Ukraine.
It could be some time.
Well, I would say never. How about, maybe 500 years, we'll see. But, and they include Crimea in that. Well, Russia's not leaving Crimea. They're not leaving the Sea of Azov coast. They're not leaving Mariupol. They're not leaving Donetsk and Luhansk. And they'll probably expand their perimeter. They're in Kherson, which controls the Dnieper River. And they may take Odessa, remains to be seen, but they may take Odessa. So they can control the Black Sea coast as well as the Sea of Azov. So they're not leaving. Now, you could have avoided the war. There was never a war easier to avoid. All Ukraine had to do was, Biden had to pick up the phone and call Zelensky. Trump did that, got impeached. But anyway, Biden would call Zelensky and say, you're not joining NATO. You're not joining the EU. You're remaining neutral. You're giving the Donbass some autonomy, and let's announce that. And Putin would have said, yeah, put it in writing. I want multiple signatories, but on that basis, it's all good. They didn't do that. You could end the war in 48 hours. I could end the war in 48 hours with the authority, which of course I don't have, to do the same thing, with one difference. Now that you've been fighting for 3 months or almost 4 months, Russia's not giving that territory back. You could have kept it if you were Ukraine, you were smart, but they've lost it. And people say, that's not fair. I'm sorry, this is a war. When you fight a war and you suffer casualties and you incur billions of dollars of expenses, it's a bloody, slow, violent process, and you make some headway, you get to keep stuff. You get to keep the grain, you get to keep the ports, you get to keep the industry, you get to keep the natural resources. That's how wars work. I don't know when they stopped teaching history, but I read a lot of history, and that's how they work. So this is a disaster for Ukraine, disaster for the Ukrainian people, but more people will die from the sanctions than on the battlefield, because by the fall, we're going to see mass starvation because of food shortages, because of the decline or elimination to some extent of Ukrainian and Russian exports of grain, and the fact that they kind of skipped the planting season. I mean, you're not going to have grain in October unless you planted it in March, and to a great extent, that planting didn't take place. But even if it does, it's not going anywhere.
And you have a book coming out later this year. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's my new book is coming out November 29th. It's called Sold Out. It's on the supply chain. Some of the things we were just talking about. The funny thing is I finished writing it pretty much around the end of February. You go through a long editorial process, and we're still tweaking it, but it's pretty much done. People go, well, Jim, how come it's not coming out till November 29th? The answer is the supply chain book is being held up by the supply chain. The paper comes from Finland. It's in short supply. You need ink. You need truck drivers to get the books moved around. My literary agent told me, she said, Jim, I represent another author. His books are printed and bound, but they can't ship them because there's no cardboard for the boxes. So whereas normally this is sort of a 3 to 4 month process, you now need 6 to 9 months of lead time. You have to get in the queue, and the burden's on you to hit all your deadlines, because if you don't, you go to the back of the queue. So, but yeah, we're on track. I did promise my editor, I said, I promise you this book will still be very timely when it comes out, because things will be worse by then. And so far that has unfortunately proved to be the case. So yeah, I'll be talking more about it in the months to come, but it's a deep dive on the supply chain, but not just that. It does look at supply chain science, supply chain management, explain what went wrong, but it also explains why it's not coming back in its current form. I talk about supply chain 1.0 from 1989 to 2019. And then I talk about supply chain 2.0, which will be 2022 and going forward. But it's going to take years to rebuild it, but it'll take a different shape. And I explain that in the book.
So a supply chain book delayed by supply chain issues. There's a kind of a poetic injustice, you might say, about that. Correct. And tell us where people can find out more about what it is that you do, where you hang out online.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at James G. Rickards. That's Rickards, all one word. So at James G. Rickards. Usually if I'm giving speeches, or I'm on tour giving, I do a lot of public speaking and events and so forth, and I always announce those on Twitter. So if you're following me on Twitter, you can also keep up with, if I do interviews, I'll put a link on Twitter. So that's just a single source that covers a lot of different activities, and hopefully people find it useful. I'm also the editor of the top financial newsletters called Strategic Intelligence. So if you just Google my name and Strategic Intelligence, you'll find it.
Right. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link to your Twitter handle and to Strategic Intelligence in the show notes in the description below this video. So anybody that wants to, and I encourage everybody to check out Jim's stuff and follow him on Twitter, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And Jim, I'd be delighted to have you back on when the book launches later in the year. But for now, Jim Rickards, thanks for joining us on GoldCore TV.
Thanks.
My thanks to Jim Rickards for coming on the show today, and his new book could not be better timed. And we look forward to chatting to him about that later in the year. Usually we remind you to hit the subscribe button to be sure you don't miss any of our conversations with market leading experts, commentators, and investors. But this week we have something new to bring you. It's the M3 report. It's our new show, and it still has all of our market leading interviews, but it also brings you further commentary from the GoldCore team, chart analysis from the brilliant Gareth Soloway, and bonus material with this week's guest, Jim Rickards. It's live now, so go and watch that next, and you can find a link in the description. Now, perception is something that's really worth considering when you're making your investment decisions and looking at market prices and commentary. And we wouldn't insult anyone's intelligence by just labeling the current narrative as a conspiracy by the global elite to distract us all. Now, we recognize that narrative spinning is something that everyone does to some extent, but we do want to explore what's going on today that makes it so powerful. How long will it succeed in distracting everyone from realizing just how bad things in the economy are? This is something that we will explore more in the coming weeks. But thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on GoldCore TV.